Hello, and welcome to the John Burt Leadership Podcast. My purpose is to help successful leaders like you to enhance your self-awareness and leadership capabilities in order to navigate the disruptive changes that you face every day. I want to help you to become a more inspiring leader and achieve the goals you set for yourself and for your team. I'm your host, John Burt, an executive leadership coach. If you're listening to this podcast, you're most likely looking for new insights and fresh perspectives on leadership. With each episode, we focus on a current leadership challenge for you and your teams, and we explore these topics through conversations with our exceptional guests, sharing our thoughts, ideas, and experiences on leadership. Now, change is inevitable and intensifying every day. You as a leader have a choice to make. Continue to learn, grow, and adapt, or risk becoming irrelevant. Thank you for your commitment to becoming a more impactful leader, ultimately contributing to making your organization and the world a better place. So let's dive in. Today's episode is building leadership presence. A topic that comes up often in my work as an executive leadership coach is executive presence. While executive presence is certainly important for a leader, executive presence is focused more on immediate impact and projecting authority. A more comprehensive concept is leadership presence, which may be defined as sustaining influence over time. Leaders need to inspire others to create and achieve common goals. So leadership presence makes sense. But what causes somebody to be compelling? What mix of skills and attributes telegraph that somebody has what it takes to be in charge? I recently had a client ask me about building her executive presence. She finished her thought by adding, "If that is even what they call it these days." That got me thinking about whether or not executive presence or leadership presence is still relevant in today's modern organization. And if so, what does it look like? Has this image formula changed at all in this age of inclusion? A spoiler alert, it's no longer about having a huge personality or dominating presence. In similar studies conducted 10 years apart, researchers and economist Sylvia Ann Hewlett found that the core principles of executive presence remained remarkably the same despite the pandemic, social and political changes, and the rise of remote or Zoom work. Those core pillars of executive presence consist of how you act, or your gravitas, how you speak, your communication, and how you look, your appearance. Hewlett also found that these pillars are not equally important and that they are highly interactive. An example might be that better communication skills will improve somebody's gravitas. We have seen a shift to a more inclusive leadership presence. Globalization has driven a focus on the diverse workforce and the benefits of tapping into underrepresented talent pools. Generational change in leadership is causing us to re-examine biases, cultural and neurodiversity, and what represents authenticity in a new way. The good news is that experts agree that executive presence or leadership presence is a skill and not a trait. Executive presence, like leadership, is a skill that can be learned and has to be cultivated to become second nature. My guest today is Christina Zini, a world-renowned executive leadership coach. Christina has also been a guest on the podcast here before. Christina is a leadership coach with over 25 years of global experience in coaching and developing people and driving transformational change. She built a successful career as a management consultant and a professional development leader with PricewaterhouseCoopers and IBM. Her passion for helping people, particularly women, advance their careers and elevate their leadership is what prompted her to launch her own leadership coaching firm over a decade ago. A self-described light liberator, Christina helps her clients deepen their self-awareness, unlock their potential, and amplify their leadership presence. A proud mom of three, Christina and her family currently reside in Houston, Texas. Christina has done extensive work to understand the dynamics of leadership presence, especially for women and underrepresented groups in the workforce. In this podcast, we will explore the three pillars of leadership presence and their key components, how inclusive leadership looks different than in the past, and practical recommendations on how you can build your leadership presence for yourself and your organization. Well, welcome, Christina. Great to have you on again. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me back again, John. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely. And as I was saying, every time I talk to you, Christina, you have so much experience and so much knowledge. It's such a pleasure because I always learn a lot, and I'm sure our listeners learn a lot of the different topics that we bring up on the show. Today, we're going to talk about executive or leadership presence, and I kind of jumped the gun there a little bit because there's a difference between executive presence and leadership presence. And a lot of our clients ask about it, want to have more of it, and are looking for our help to build it. But maybe we could start. What is the difference, and how do you define leadership presence?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as you and I were even preparing for this podcast, we went back and forth as well. Like, are we talking about executive presence? Are we talking about leadership presence? Are we talking about both? So, just to keep things simple and concise today, we're going to be focusing on leadership presence. And I'd like to start by even making that distinguishing between executive presence and leadership presence. So, oftentimes when we think about executive presence, we're thinking about that high stakes environment, perhaps even up in front of a board or in front of the media, where we want a presence that's going to make that immediate impact, right? That's going to project authority. Oftentimes we associate that as well with someone who's at the executive level, right? So executive presence is still very much relevant today within a certain context and of course, at a certain stage of a career. Leadership
Mhm.
presence, though, I feel like is a much, sort of broader concept. And that's really about how do we sustain the ability to influence and to inspire and engage the people around us over a longer period of time. It's independent of hierarchy and our position, right? And it's something that we can exercise and employ in day to day interaction. So, like I said, both executive presence and leadership presence are crucial, to our careers, but they're emphasized in different contexts and different stages of our careers.
Mhm. And what do you think? Do you think most people are, when they ask the question, do I need more executive presence? I'm looking for that next promotion, or do you think they're really looking for leadership presence? Is that what they're really after?
I do. And I think because oftentimes executive presence is used again rather loosely, and most people don't know the distinction between the two. For the purposes of our conversation today, we're just going to use the terminology leadership presence so that we can again speak to a broader audience, right? And talk about, again, the presence that is really going to evoke, that inspiration and that influence and that impact that we're looking for. Now, there's a
Mhm.
few key components of leadership presence that I want to call out. And much of what I'm about to share is actually based on research and a couple of books by Sylvia Ann Hewlett. So
Mhm.
she sort of broke the presence down into how you act, which is also associated with gravitas. And we're going to get into defining that in just a moment. How you speak, communicate, and then three, how you look, which is your appearance. And so those are sort of the main components that help support one's presence.
Mhm.
These traits are interactive, though, right? So, whilst your gravitas tends to be like of the most importance, how you communicate is a deal breaker, right? If you aren't able to articulate yourself and present yourself clearly, that can be a big blow to your gravitas. Just as well as, while appearance isn't as important, it can be a distraction, right? If you're not, pulled together or polished in a certain way. So we'll
Right. You
talk a
need
little
to,
bit more in depth into all these three areas as our conversation continues.
yeah. I mean, so you need to have them all, but they wind up supporting, and they're integrated in a way in terms of how they all help to build that executive presence. Now, one of the things I've been reading, of course, is that leadership presence has changed, or executive presence has changed over the years, and especially post COVID, right? What is the new normal, if you will, for leadership presence in today's context?
Yeah, John, I like to talk about inclusive leadership presence, and that is making a significant shift away from that very stereotypical mold of what we have previously associated with someone who's in a leadership role or someone who's in an executive role. We're seeing these shifts towards more inclusive definitions of leadership because of the globalization of our economy, right? We have more diverse workforces in all forms, and we're tapping into underrepresented talented pools, right? And that is a wonderful thing, right? That we've broken past a lot of barriers, challenged our own biases and stereotypes, and really thought out of the box about talent and how do we really embrace and tap into underrepresented talent pools. Of course, there's also generational changes, right, that have resulted in our society again becoming more accepting and more inclusive. Is there more work to be done? Absolutely. But what I like to think of when I think about inclusive leadership presence is being able to really be able to broadly, accept and celebrate and include many different types of leadership styles and the ways in which people present themselves, their gravitas, how they communicate, and of course their appearance as well. Now,
Mm-hmm.
this is going to be influenced by culture, even by industry, right? Certain industries have, different norms around what qualifies as leadership presence and how you present oneself. It can also, be, influenced by the part of the world that you're in and
Mm-hmm.
your neurodiversity and so forth. So there's a lot of different factors that can, influence one's leadership presence.
Well, I love that idea of inclusive leadership presence, and we've talked a lot about the fact that leadership is no longer top down, right? Anybody can lead within the organization, and from any position. It's not a title based thing. So that really taps into it. And I think you and I both have seen the differences in the industries that we've worked in and worked both as coaches and consultants. What works in Silicon Valley, right, at a high tech company, and what works in New York on Wall Street are going to be completely different. And maybe what works, in London or Amsterdam, these are all going to be differences that the global companies are need to tap into in terms of the next generation of leaders. So are there some things that maybe for some of us, are there some things that have sustained and that are still relevant in terms of the kind of the traditional style of executive presence or leadership presence?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I believe there's two elements that still remain absolutely critical, and that's confidence and decisiveness. So,
Mm-hmm.
while we're moving away from like this cookie cutter approach to leadership, which narrowly focuses on a lot of these superficial traits and presents, kind of like this sort of same mold, we're getting rid of a lot of the superfluous components of leadership presence that really don't matter. But what does matter is one's ability to demonstrate confidence and decisiveness. And that's going to stick with us, for the time being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and definitely. So let's talk a little bit about the gravitas, right? The how you act as an element of a leadership presence. So is this the most important one, Christina?
Yeah, it's considered the most important of all the three that I mentioned. And as I was doing some research on like how to best define gravitas, I came across like, a little formula, if you will, that says gravitas is really like your expertise plus your emotional intelligence plus your passion, right? That's really what gravitas represents. And the real benefit of gravitas and being able to build and display your gravitas is that helps you inspire, influence, and make an impact on the people around you. So when you talk about people who have a lot of gravitas, it's usually because there's this like just a certain weight to them and dignity to them. They might be very knowledgeable in their field. or they might have a particular vision. They've got that charisma. They're able to come in and kind of take command in a room and just demonstrate that gravitas, which, as I said, is likely a combination of not just their expertise, but also that emotional intelligence and that just passion or charisma.
Yeah, yeah, we all know people who are experts at something, but they lack a vision about where things are going, and they have difficulty in connecting with people. So I love that the amalgamy of traits that make up that gravitas, the presence in the room, the ability to command the room. And you mentioned EQ or emotional intelligence, right? Because in this area, it is about connecting with people, right? Your ability to connect your vision and with the emotions and dreams and aspirations of the people who are working for you. So any particular tips for how to build gravitas?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I'm going to throw a few C words out at you. One is, of course, composure, right? Because part of demonstrating gravitas is the ability to remain poised, right? And that can be difficult under really tense circumstances. It starts with like that self-awareness, right? And then being able to, regulate your emotions. So one tip that just I think helps people maintain their poise is to prepare before you're going into a situation, do some visualizations, like take some deep breaths. And I always like, to really connect to the feet and to the ground. That kind of grounds someone and helps them remain poised throughout whatever situation they happen to find themselves in. The other C that I'll throw out there is confidence. We were just talking about confidence and how important that is. But that is really, what people tend to associate gravitas with is just that confidence of just knowing your stuff, like hard and cold, being knowledgeable and experienced, and being able to convey that in a way that, again, demonstrates integrity, builds trust, really helps people, feel again that you're in command, that you know what you're doing, that they're a leader that you can count on. And how you do that is really through the third C that I'll mention, and that's connection, right? And being able to evoke that authentic, inclusive style of leadership, to be respectful to the people around you, again, to act with integrity. And this is where the emotional intelligence component can really come in and shine and help leaders, to connect with confidence, right? And to maintain their composure in stressful circumstances.
Yeah, I know leadership is around having to deal with crises. So that ability to be calm in the storm is definitely attractive in terms of people who are dealing with the storm and maybe not sure what to do. Right, as you said, the competence, knowing your stuff cold, and also being able to be calm and be able to deliver in that moment is extremely important. And so I love the three C's for gravitas. That's a good way to remember it. And also, I guess the vision thing, right? That is included in your competency, right? Is wherever you're going, whatever expertise you have in, you need to be looking beyond the day to day in terms of being able to present to the team where things are going, right? Where are you leading them, and be able to be connected in that regard. So if you think about the second element, which is the communications, the how do you speak, there are certain things that I've read which are definitely out, and then there are some things that are in. On the things that are out, right? It's the joking around, the bantering. It used to be that executives made a big deal about the fact that you could joke around and you could be funny or be somewhat humorous, but typically those things tend to fall flat because they most people don't know how to be really funny. But no more joking, no more bantering. But what's the new in thing for communication?
Yeah, that's a good point. And obviously, you and I both know, having worked overseas, that jokes and banter they often fall flat in other cultures, right? So
Mhm.
I think that's certainly part of why, joking and bantering and sometimes just overuse of humor aren't necessarily effective ways of communicating in globally diverse audiences. What is listening. Like listening is right one of the buzzwords at the moment, and hopefully will remain so because this is about really listening to learn and listening to build connection. And so many times when we think about leaders, especially top executives, we're often imagining them being the ones doing the talking. But the
Mhm.
most effective leaders I know are excellent listeners. They've developed a real skill of active listening, being able to also ask questions and to reflect and to challenge, right? To employ that sort of coach approach to their leadership. And so I want to point out, though, that we live in a world where so much of the work we do is now online, right? We're meeting in virtual environments. And
Mhm.
so
Yeah.
for leaders to be effective communicators, that also means that they need to be able to communicate through virtual meetings, right? And through team messaging channels. And that all of that, of course, aligns again with how they communicate in person as well. So that's about
Mhm.
authentic messaging across all of your channels, right? And being able to ensure that your personal brand as a leader is aligned again in your messaging, whether it's through a Zoom meeting or a Slack channel, or whether you're talking in front of a small group or standing on stage in front of a large audience, that you're mindful of like your tone and your pitch and your pace, and that's matching, of course, the message and the context and the audience that's in front of you. Also being mindful of your body language.
Oh
So
yeah.
often we forget about the importance of that aspect. We're more focused on our voice and what we're saying as opposed to just how our bodies are also conveying messages and speaking for us too. And that's just as important in a virtual meeting as it is in person. So
Mhm.
a couple of like quick strategies that I like to think of that help us to just improve both our verbal and our nonverbal communications is to make eye contact, right? And that includes, in virtual meetings as well, right? To be able to look into the camera, or when you're sitting in front of people or standing in front of a room, that you maintain steady eye contact at all times. So that is probably my number one tip today, is just be very mindful of your eye contact. Be thoughtful as well about using your hand gestures. You'll notice now about how I'm using my hand gestures if you're watching us on YouTube. But think about, how you want to use your hand gestures to emphasize a point, for example. We talked about active listening, and that's my other great tip, is just to continue to hone your active listening skills. That is again going to really make or break you as a leader. And then lastly, my third tip around communications, thinking about that old adage of clear is kind, right? Being clear and succinct and transparent in your messaging, right? That is an act of kindness. This is not to be confused with niceness, but this is really about being just upfront and honest and respectful with the people around you. And that
Mhm.
too goes a long way. Like I said before, while gravitas is certainly the most important of these three elements, how you communicate again is a make or break factor in your ability to really demonstrate your gravitas and take command of a room, and to be able to convey your messages confidently, and be able to cultivate that trust and rapport with the people around you.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely agree that communication is just a key element in leadership, and the different elements that you mentioned, both how you speak, how you deliver what you're trying to say, but the active listening and the authenticity are elements that make that communication powerful and more meaningful. And I love the idea of it's an act of kindness, right? The listener shouldn't have to struggle to try to understand what it is you're trying to say. That only confuses people. Now the third one, we all think about how you look and your appearance as being the most important one, but in fact, it's not, right? It's not the most important one. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's considered the least important of the three, with gravitas being, of course, the most important, followed by communications. The reason why appearance is still important, though, is that it's a very common first filter, right? When we first meet someone, our brains are just kind of wired to like immediately make judgments, immediately to sort of compute what we're seeing, eyes to our brains. That just happens, right? And so I believe that appearance is still very critical because of those first impressions, right? And again, like I said early on, appearance, when it's not well presented, and by that I mean sort of polished and put together, it can be distracting to people and it can detract from your ability to get your message across and so forth. So, we were talking like about what's sort of old school, what's out now and what's in. And so out are these notions around physical attractiveness. And again, trying to fit a very unrealistic, mold of looking a certain way, right? What's in now is what we call polish. And that's being well groomed, evoking a sense of vitality, no matter what your age, right? Of having that vitality and that zest, that energy, and so forth. Being authentic, right? And there's sort of like a balance between professionalism and being authentic, right? What I might feel comfortable in at home, I want to carry forth and demonstrate sort of the brand of Christina Zini, yet I'm not going to do so in what I might wear on the weekends when I'm chasing my kids around the soccer field, for example. That said, there is what we call like the new normal of attire, right? And that's about, dressing for the situation or the occasion you're in. And like the best example that I like to use about new normal attire is what you see with a lot of like the tech execs, right? And you'll see them in front of an audience and they're often wearing a black t-shirt. Like I feel like there's a little bit of a uniform there, but it's sort of like black t-shirt and, pair of stylish jeans and some sort of like casual but expensive sneaker, right? That's kind of like their look. And what works in the tech industry is quite different than what works on Wall Street, for example. Yet those same, tech CEOs, when they come and sit before Congress, like they did not that long ago, they swapped out those outfits and put on their suit and tie, right? So they were understanding of like, this is the environment that I'm in, and that calls for me, to present myself in a slightly different way than I would when I'm back in my office and so forth. So just, one example of what we call the new normal attire. You might dress differently based on the environment that you're in or, the purpose, whether it's a retreat versus, a boardroom meeting and so forth.
Right. But the message, right, is about, being well groomed, polish, do the best with what you've got, not trying to be some ideal or something you're not. And I really love that, because I think everybody kind of gets the idea that a certain amount of grooming is required for work, but it's doing, being as taking care of yourself and, dressing appropriately for the occasion and being authentic to yourself. I love the idea you mentioned about creating a brand as well, Christina. I think that these days people do create brands. Just one leader that I know always wears a red jacket, loves wearing red jackets to events, and that's her brand is the red jacket. And people see that and sometimes they make fun of her, but they all know that this is her brand, and it really works for her as a kind of a tool of creating that gravitas in a situation where she walks into the room. So great. So the appearance, even though it's rated the least important, it obviously has an immediate impact and sort of do the best with what you got. Now, Christina, you're a leadership coach and you do a lot of work with leaders, but you specialize in working with women. So is there a gender or a difference? Are there specific general gender differences around leadership presence that you want the audience to know about?
Yeah, so everything that I've shared so far is applicable really to any leader. However, I do feel like, there are many challenges that women and other underrepresented groups have faced. I found just a great quote in Harvard Business Review that I'd like to share with the audience, if that's okay. I feel like it just kind of sums up the situation perfectly. And here I quote, women and people of color no longer have to fit into a mold not fashioned for them, but they must still cultivate a confident, decisive, polished, and commanding persona without running afoul of biased social norms that punish them for overstepping.
Mm.
End quote. And so
Yeah.
I thought that was a really powerful quote because it does acknowledge, that these molds that I was talking about early on, they were not fashioned for women and for people of color and for other underrepresented groups. They were just, we couldn't fit in no matter how hard we tried, right? And so the good news is that, there's been a significant shift away from that mold. Like the quote says, though, it's still important to really cultivate, that confidence, that decisiveness, that polish, that gravitas, right, for women and for people of color. Yet, regardless of how much progress we're made, we're still kind of swimming in the same soup. There's still some, social norms and biases that can potentially get in our way, more or less. So what I like to work with my clients on is really thinking about their own um their own poise, right? And their own posture and how they can exude confidence in a way that makes them stand out from the people around them. So just a couple of really quick tips, very practical tips that I like to share with my female clients. One is posture. And now the reason why I'm mentioning, some very physical oriented tips is that women just tend to be, not always, but tend to be smaller in stature, right? So posture is a big one. And even thinking about your shoulder positioning. Now, if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll notice that I'm like tapping on my shoulders and just demonstrating when you square your shoulders off and you hold yourself, erect, that conveys actually greater authority and command than it does if you find yourself sort of slouching over or looking down, right? So it posture and eye contact, a longer stride when you're in person. This is a wonderful tip that I learned from a recent talk by a University of Michigan lecturer. She talked about walking to the podium, and when she wants to present herself again with more gravitas, she'll lengthen her stride as she moves towards the podium, right? And that also conveys greater authority. It kind of makes you look taller and, of greater stature, right? I'm a big believer in a firm handshake, right? Firm handshake with eye contact. So again, coming back to the eye contact, that is a way in which women and people of color and other representative groups can really increase the way that they're perceived as confident, decisive leaders, maintaining that eye contact. I absolutely believe in all of us being able to be true to ourselves and to be authentic. So lead with your strengths, right? Show up as your best self. And that's really what this is about. It's like showing up with your best self. Terms of verbally, be mindful of saying, I'm sorry. Women tend to apologize a lot. We over apologize. And also, even being mindful of saying thank you for opportunities. Now, I'm a person who loves to say thank you, and this is something that has tripped me up in the past, but I'm relearning to say thank you. I'm grateful that you have acknowledged the value of my skills and my experience, right? As opposed to saying, wow, thanks for this opportunity, like as if, they've taken a chance on you. But just think about how and way you express gratitude for for someone else's ability to value the skills and experience that you bring, right? So it's like a thank you from an empowered place. And
Yeah.
lastly, I mentioned, clear is kind a little while ago, and I just really want to come back to that since a lot of women, tend to lead with niceness. And again, I'm making some generalizations here, of course, and I'm speaking about myself. We tend to be people pleasers. And so this is coming back to that notion of like, be succinct, be transparent, be clear. That is an act of kindness. So I'll stop there, John, and just see what's coming up for you as I'm sort of sharing some tips and strategies, that I've used with the women I've worked with and other people who represent different diversity groups.
No, I think that the advice has been that you've offered throughout, Christina, has been fantastic, and I appreciate you sharing your experiences and some of the work that you're doing in the coaching realm, especially with women, because I think that these are some tips that can be put to use immediately. We do have a new inclusive leadership presence model that's developed. And I think it's great for all of us. I think it's great for companies and organizations. I think it's great for the leaders and for the workers. And so the suggestions that you've offered today have been spot on. Thank you so much. Thank you for being willing to come on and share your experience with us.
Yeah, thanks again for having me, John. It's always fun to return to your podcast, and I know we have so much in common from our background and our passion for developing leaders. I just thought I'd mention that, you can find me, of course, on LinkedIn as Christina Zini, and that's Christina with a CH, last name Zini. There's only one of me. I'm also on Instagram and Facebook by that name as well. And if you're interested, I'm offering your listeners, a free 30-minute strategy session with me to talk about your leadership style and your leadership presence. I currently have a special offer, which is basically 3 60-minute coaching sessions to help people elevate their leadership style and maximize their presence. And as part of that package, it includes a free strengths assessment and a values exercise that will help form the basis of our conversations about leadership style and presence. So
wow, what an incredible offer. Thanks for sharing that, Christina. And I'm sure that people will take advantage of it for sure. So for our listeners, thank you again for tuning in. We always appreciate it. Christina and I both share this passion for helping leaders to improve, and hopefully that we hit the mark on this one. We're going to add Christina's bio and contact information into the notes for this podcast, so you'll be able to see that in whichever channel you pick it up on. But thank you again, Christina. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to the audience for listening in, and hope to see you next time.
Thanks, John.